To add more instructions and tell Node.js what to do if we got a request that's coming in, we go back to line 3 here. And here we can do something which we already saw before in the previous JavaScript course sections when we worked with event listeners. We can point at a function here and pass a pointer at another function as a parameter value to create server. For this, I'll add a function here and I'll name it handle request, though this name is up to you. But this is a function that should handle incoming requests, hence this name should make sense. Now that's a regular, standard JavaScript function as we saw it before in the course already. Now here, for create server, we can pass handle request as a parameter value, but we don't execute it here, we don't add parentheses, instead we omit those and we just use the function name here, as we did it for event handlers earlier in the course. We just point at this function. And with that, we let Node.js know that it's this handle request function that should be executed once we got an incoming request. Because create server as a first argument, as a first parameter value, wants a request listener. And a request listener in the end should just be a function. A function that then itself takes certain parameter values though. To be precise, a function that takes a parameter value that describes the incoming request, and hence I'll name it request, and a second parameter value that takes a response object that will allow us to send back a response later. Now it can be confusing that we have a function with these parameter values here, which we then pass as a parameter value itself to another function or method. But create server simply wants a function as a parameter value that then itself takes these two parameter values. Because values for request and response will be passed into this function once Node.js executes this function for us whenever a request is reaching that server. So whenever a request is reaching this Node.js server, Node.js will execute this function for us, and it will pass in an object with more data about the request and another object that allows us to send back a response. That's all done automatically by Node.js. And therefore now in this handle request function, we can now work with this request and, for example, extract data from it and or prepare a response that should be sent back. Now at the moment I don't want to work with the request. At the moment I want to focus on the response instead and ignore the request for now. At the moment we need no data from the incoming request. But we definitely should send back a response, because if you create a web server that does not send back responses to requests, it will be an invalid web server and browsers will show errors when they try to talk to it, because a web server needs to send back responses for incoming requests. Therefore here, inside of handle request, we can now use this response object to prepare and send back a response. And for this, using the dot notation, we got various properties and methods that we can utilize here. Now I'm not getting auto-completion here because my IDE here doesn't understand that handle request will be used here for create server, but I'll still show you properties and methods that you can use. And it all starts with the status code property, written like that with a capital C, that you can set on the response. So this is not a method you can call, but a property you can set. And status codes simply are ways of telling a browser whether a request succeeded or not. If you want to communicate a success, you should set it to 200 typically. On the other hand, you might have seen the status code 404 before, if you, visited any website before in your life, because that's a status code which is used to communicate from a server to the browser that the browser tried to access a website that doesn't exist, or a page, a part of a website that doesn't exist. Now here I want to communicate a success case, hence I'll set the status code to 200. Now in the next line, after setting that status code, I now want to again use response and send the response. So tell Node.js that I'm done preparing the response, and also set the data that should be part of the response. For example, the text or the HTML code that should be shown by the browser. Before we did create HTML files for that. Now here, since we control what happens on the server with Node.js, we can define the HTML code that should be sent back here in our JavaScript code, because since you learned before, one of the ideas of using server-side code is that you can generate HTML code dynamically, so that you write code that generates HTML code. And that's what I'll do here. For this, we can use the end method on the response to end preparing the response and to send it to the client. And to end, you can pass the data that should be sent. And here we could send a very basic piece of HTML code where we create a h1 element, opening and closing tags, and between that, hello world. Now, of course, writing HTML code like this will be way more cumbersome than putting it into files, but this will only be a temporary solution. You will soon learn how to use files again. For the moment, just write it as text without body and head and anything like that here in this end method. And if you do all of that, you can now save this file, and now we'll execute this file again. So let's now test whether everything worked. For that, again, I'll use this integrated terminal. And just as before, I want to execute this app.js file with it. For this here, I'll again write node, blank, and then app.js. And if you hit enter, you'll notice something interesting. You don't get an error, and you don't get any special output, but you also don't get back into the command mode. You can't write another command. I mean, you can type here, but actually it's kind of blocked. You're not entering a new line. Just to show you the comparison, if I press Ctrl C, which stops this running process and gets out of this blocked mode, this is the normal entry mode, where you have some information in front of your cursor. It will be different for you, but you have something in front of your cursor. And if I hit enter, for example, here, then you see new lines are being started. Now, if I type node app.js as I did before, this does not happen. I do get a new line, but not with that part in front of the cursor. And that means that actually this process, which we started with node app.js, is still running and hasn't finished yet. And that is actually what we want here and what should be expected. Because we did now start our own server. By executing this Node.js code, we started our own server. And such a server isn't a process that stops suddenly. Instead, it should keep on running because it should keep on handling requests. If our server would stop, browsers would not be able to send requests to it, and that's not what we want here. Therefore, this is what should happen, that this process is now stuck and not stopped. You can always finish it manually by hitting Ctrl C, as I mentioned before. Now that's our own web server running on our local machine, and don't worry, it will not be exposed to other people in the world unless your local network setup is allowing requests from other computers. But by default that should not be the case, and it's not changed by this code. But we can now send a request to this server from inside our own computer, since the server is running on our computer. So even without the network being opened up, we can still send a request to the server if we use a browser installed on the same computer. So therefore here I'll go back to my browser, and here you can now enter localhost :3000. Localhost is simply an alias that refers to your local computer, so it's like Amazon.com, but just the address of your local computer. And then :3000 is used to target a specific port. And here I'm using 3000 because that's the port on which I'm listening. If you use the different port here, you need to enter the different port number here after the colon. But I do recommend that you do follow along with 3000. And if you now hit enter, you should see hello world here. And you will actually see that if you inspect this, this is an H1 element, hello world, because I did send back my response with this H1 element inside of it. That's the response data. Now we also have a head and body tag around that because that's added automatically by the browser if it's missing in the response, but the response itself is only this H1 tag here. We can also see this, by the way, if you go to the DevTools and there the Network tab, and you then reload the page by pressing this reload icon. Here you see all the requests your browser might be sending, and here you should see this request to localhost 3000, and if you click on it, you see more information about this request. And here you see a preview of the response, but if you click on response, you also see the response data itself, and here you see it's only this H1 text. And this is now a website that is displayed by the browser just as it was before in the course, but the code, the HTML code that is being displayed, is now not actually code that we wrote in some HTML file, which we then clicked on or served with the development server, but instead it's some HTML response that is generated and sent back by our own Node.js server. And therefore this Node.js server now also replaces this development server extension which we used before in Visual Studio Code, because now we don't need that extra development server created by the extension, since we do create our very own server with Node.js here. Now, the advantages of using Node.js might not yet be obvious, since we still have, in the end, static pre-written HTML code here, but this is a crucial first step to dive deeper into Node.js, because this is basically the main entry point of any website that you are building with Node.js. You always start by setting up a server, and then you can add more features in a next step. And that's what we'll do throughout the rest of the course, but these are the crucial basics. Now with that, for the moment, I'll stop this running Node.js server here by going into the terminal and hitting Ctrl+C, and this will stop it. And once you stopped it, if you visit localhost 3000 again, you'll get an error because this server isn't running anymore. Whenever you want to continue working on the code, you therefore have to re-execute node app.js to start that server again. But that's something we'll do later. For the moment, this is what I want to finish with, and now it's time to dive deeper into Node.js and what we can build with it.